We're talking with Joe Guerra. Would you give us your full birth name, please?
The way it appears on my birth certificate,
Yes.
Jose Antonio Guerra,
And you were born on what day?
July the 9th, 1934,
And you were born in what town?
Laredo, Texas.
Your parents were, by name,
Jose Margarito Guerra and Josefina Valls Guerra.
and where did you live growing up?
Well, Bob,
What was your first home? Do you remember?
the first home that I remember was a home on, I think it's on Houston Street. I think it's the 800 block of Houston. Of course, the house itself is not there anymore. There's a big brick two-story structure there, which is currently being used by the one of the local bus companies. Mm-hmm. The house that my family was living in when I was young and growing up was a wooden structure. It had about 6 or 7 rooms, and I still have some very vivid memories of that residence because right next door we used to have of all things, a Gulf service station, and my younger brother Richard and my younger sister Josie and I used to walk, from our house right next door, and the man that was, I guess, the operator of the facility at the time, a man by the name of Sabino Garza, used to give us candies and chewing gums. And he also happens to be the father of our present County Commissioner, Julie Gutierrez. Mm-hmm. So.
Well, what are your first memories, though? When you think about going back to childhood, what are your first memories that come to mind?
Well.
Were you 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 or roughly?
Maybe 3 or 4, Bob. I remember some of my earliest experiences was my mother, trying to, feed us the things that she thought were important, such as vegetables. And I remember the distinct distaste that I had for spinach, for broccoli, and for green beans and all those other green vegetables. But bless her heart, she made us eat them. And as it turned out, Bob, it was a very good habit that she forced upon not only me but my brother and my sister. And
tell us about your brother and sister. Were they older or younger? Or?
Well, no. I was born in 1934, and my younger brother, he was born in 35, mm-hmm. and my younger sister was born in 1936. So
you were the senior member of the family, as it were, as far as the children go.
Yes, I was the firstborn, and I also have the distinction of having been the first grandchild born to my grandparents on both sides of my parents. So I was, I remember I was a very special young person whenever I went to their house.
Do you remember their names?
Yes.
Do you remember your mother's parents and your father's parents? Do you remember their names?
Yes. My mother's parents used to live about a block and a half from where we lived. They lived in a brick home, which was located right at the corner of San Bernardo and Victoria. Well, that's where the present Norwest drive-in facility stands now. Mm-hmm. And I have some very vivid memories of, when visiting them when I was young, because they also had a very large family. I think something like 9 or 10 uncles and aunts, and they would have some very big reunions, and we still have some family pictures, from from those years that we have saved, and they bring back a lot of memories, Bob. I was in several of those pictures, sitting by myself next to my sister, and my younger brother was somewhere in the background with one of my uncles sitting on his lap, I think, and it was like I mentioned previously, a very large family, a very close-knit family, and a family that had lost their fortune right before I was born, during the darker days of the Depression. My grandfather was an onion grower in the area of South Webb County, and he had borrowed some money from a private source, and he had put up his farm as collateral, and when he couldn't repay the loan, the person who lent him the money took the ranch from him, and most of his assets, both liquid and otherwise, were tied up in that property, and
Lost everything.
lost everything, yes. And I think for the most part, my family on my mother's side was still reeling from the after effects of all those shocking events that had taken place right before I was born, back in the very early 30s, late 20s, early 30s.
So it was the beginning of the Depression, really.
Well,
In the early 30s, was it?
Yeah, right after the crash of 1929, a lot of things started, going haywire with our economy, and but what I did learn, especially from my mother, and from my father also, was the virtues of thrift, frugality, and a lot of virtues that
Hard work.
the work ethic, and a lot of virtues integrity, of course, and honesty, and self-reliance that to this day have served me very well, and I'm very proud that my mother, although she passed away last year in March, it'll be a year and about 2 more months.
In March of 1997 is when she died, right?
No, she died in March of 1998.
98. Right?
98, yes, sir. I wanted to, when we had the wake and the funeral, I wanted to get up and, eulogize her in my own way. But I was so overcome with grief that I thought that I would say say what I wanted to say by just staying silent. So.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's go back a little bit. Do you remember the names of your grandparents?
Yes, my maternal grandparents were Antonio Valls, and his wife, my grandmother, was Rafaela Mendiola Valls. Mm-hmm. My maternal grandparent came from Spain, by way of Cuba and by way of Mexico. He had this burning desire, to come to the promised land and get away from all the, problems in Europe at the time. This was, right after Spain had ceased to be a world power, right after Spain had lost the war, the Cuban-American War, and I guess economic conditions in Spain at that time were very hard, and my grandfather was a relatively young man at that time, and he wanted to come to the United States, so he did, by way of the Canary Islands, Cuba, and then Mexico, and then he finally wound up here in Laredo, Texas.
Now, what about your father's parents?
Well, my grandmother, my maternal grandmother came from Monterrey, mm-hmm. Mexico. She was
What was her name? Do you know?
Rafaela Mendiola. She was a very sturdy lady. I remember she was thick-boned and very stout, very strong-willed lady, and
Industrious.
industrious. Yes, and she was a very tidy lady. You could tell that she was very meticulous in her appearance and in her demeanor, and she also had a strong sense of discipline about her that I'll never forget, because since I was, as I previously mentioned, I was the first grandchild, and I tended to be a little on the spoiled side. She was always
Brought you back to reality. Huh?
well, yeah. She would tell my mother, you got to spank this little boy. She said, he crosses the line too many times.
A little discipline, right?
So, and that's about all I.
What about her husband? Do you remember her?
Well, and also I remember my grandmother, Bob, because she was, she developed, in her later years, she developed a malignancy in either her pancreas or her liver, which, of course, back in those days was, terminal. We didn't have the medical technology or the medical advances that we have today, and but the family being as close knit as it was, and as united as it was, passed ahead, amongst all the members, and two of my uncles took her to the Mayo Clinic,
In Minnesota.
in Minnesota, to see if some doctor up there could cure her. But by the time they got over there, the cancer had metastasized to such an extent that it really was a terminal case. So all they could do was just tell him to bring her back home, and she passed away eventually, about 6 or 8 or 10 months after that. So she's been gone now for over 50 years. My grandfather, however, survived her, and he lived on until about 1971. So he was well into his 90s when he passed away. On my father's side, my paternal grandfather, his name was Margarito Guerra Aguirre, and from what my dad tells me, my paternal grandfather had a very colorful history also, because he was a native of Old Guerrero in Mexico, which was a city that was settled, by family by the name of Guerra, which he was a relative to those people. And he also, decided to come to the American side of the Rio Grande, because I guess he perceived that his dreams would be somewhat limited or restricted in Mexico if he would have stayed over there. So he came and he settled in a little ranch east of us called Los Ojuelos.
Now, Old Guerrero is the area that was flooded by Lake Falcone, right?
Lake Falcone, yes.
When they filled it up.
Right. But they were fortunate. They were able to save all the archives, and if by studying the archives, you can discover that my great grandparents were involved in the settlement of that city.
Well, it was a beautiful city, very ornate, very architecturally sound.
Very,
it was
very picturesque also.
Ahead of its time, you might say, at the time, wasn't it?
Yes. They had also, the reason for that also was that they had some French and some German settlers that, gave them their expertise as far as the architecture and as far as the engineering to help them build those buildings. So what I'm trying to say is that all that didn't happen just by accident. It happened by design, and I guess that was one of the major reasons.
Well, let's go back. When you your first memories when you were 3 or 4 or 5, what was a radio like in those days? I mean, what do you remember from those days? I mean, that was a long time ago.
Bob, all I remember was the downtown section. There really wasn't anything much. There was a little bit out in the heights. Of course, no
paved streets, of course.
Well, very few paved streets. Of course, for the most part, all the streets downtown were paved. The major streets like Matamoros and Houston, and the streets where the hotels were on, San Bernardo and Salinas, and
some of the shops and all that.
Yeah, I remember the stores, like S.H. Kress, McClellan's, Woolworths, because we used to have a weekly experience that my parents would take us there when we were little kids, and if we had been, if we had behaved appropriately the week prior, they would buy us a little toy or what have you, and that was always one of our experiences that we would look forward to, and so.
What did you do to amuse yourself in those days?
Well,
I mean, there wasn't any television in those days, was there?
No, Bob, but we did have radio, so, we would listen to the radio, and of course, by listening to the radio, you had to imagine everything, see, so, like for example, a baseball game. I remember I used to listen to baseball games, and I would hear my heroes like Lou Gehrig and Babe Ruth and Joe DiMaggio and Ted Williams, Bob Feller, and as I was growing up, those guys were really my big Stan Musial, from the St. Louis Cardinals.
All Hall of Fame players, right?
Yeah, absolutely. 100% true American folk heroes. I would listen to the radio, and I would listen to the play-by-play description of the radio announcer, and you, like I say, you would have to imagine everything. You weren't glued to the boob tube like we are nowadays, and I think for the in a lot of ways that was better, you see, because if you had other things to do, you could always kind of keep an ear on what was going on the radio, but you still had time to like wash the dishes or wash your clothes or clean your room, whatever chores our mother would assign to us. And that was another thing about, that I failed to mention about my mother, is that as we were growing up, she told us, look, I know you two are boys, and your sister is a girl, but you're going to have to learn how to sweep the room. You're going to have to learn how to dust. You're going to have to learn how to pick up all your stuff. You're going to have to learn how to make your bed. And you're going to have to learn. You're going to have to help me wash the clothes, because in those days, Bob, we had one of those washing irons, washboards,
a rub board.
A rub board, yeah, and a bar of soap, with a ivory soap, laundry. And let me tell you, I mean,
you didn't have a washing machine or a dryer, right?
I think the only people that had a washing machine on the block were, a lot more affluent than we were, and we used to kind of just cry a little bit every time we would see them use it, because eventually we did get a washing machine, but it was a few years later. We also didn't have too much clothing. In fact, when we would put on our Sunday best, my mother would always admonish us that as soon as we got back from church or from wherever we were going, we were to take off our Sunday duds, hang them up in the closet, and put on our regular clothing, because if she saw us that we went outside and got it dirty or something, there would be hell to pay. So.
Well, now let's talk about going to school. Do you remember going to school for the first time?
Oh yes, Bob, I sure do.
Was it the kindergarten or first grade, or what was it?
It was a first grade, I think.
What was the name of the school? Do you remember?
Ursuline, yeah.
Ursuline Academy?
Yes. It was a little one-room schoolroom.
You were taught by a nun?
Yes, a sister, I think her name was Sister Fidelis. Bless her heart, a little Irish nun. And I was so scared that day, Bob. And, my mother was there, of course. She took me. And
did you walk to school?
no, I think she drove me. And my mother drove me. And there comes a point in time where the parent has to leave, And I said, Mother, please don't leave me. I said, I was so scared.
Yes, of course. Well, she drove you to school. Did you have a car? Did the family have a car? I mean,
yes, Bob. We had an old 34 Ford that my dad had bought, and of course, my dad worked at the Laredo National Bank when it was down at its original location downtown at the corner of Farragut and Flores. And then if my mother needed to, was going to need the car for anything during the day, he would leave the car there and he would just walk to work. So.
But you went to school and you were really scared that first day, right?
I was scared out of my mind, but the sister was very nice and very helpful, and I'll always be grateful that she was also a big role model for me, believe it or not.
First grade.
First grade teacher, yes, Sister Fidelis. And at noon, because in those days, you went to school in the morning and you didn't get out till in the afternoon. It wasn't a half-day session or anything like that.
What time would you get out?
Oh, I don't know, about 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock, I don't remember. But anyway, my mother showed up at noon, I remember, and she...
Did you bring you lunch or something? Or?
Oh, yes. So that kind of, smoothed things over. But, she brought pots and pans because she wanted me to have a real nice meal and all that. And I said, Mother, you shouldn't have done this. Nobody, look, all the children here, they all bring brown bags. I said, don't ever bring... so I was kind of embarrassed, but
your mother brought you a hot lunch, right?
Yeah.
How many children were in the class? Do you remember that first year?
No, not very many, Bob. I'd say 15, maybe. No more than 18, I don't think.
Did you know some of them? I mean, had you seen them around the neighborhood or something?
No, I can't say that I have, Bob.
I mean, that first year is always a little traumatic, and
yeah.
You walk in there, they're all strangers.
A lot of strange faces, yeah, that I'd never seen before, but I guess, I don't know, from there I went like 3 years or 2 years, and then we transferred over to St. Peter's, and by that time my brother and my sister were also ready to start going to school. So
they all went to St. Peter's together?
Yes, we all went together.
You could walk to St. Peter's, right?
Well, no, my dad used to take us in the morning, but we would leave very early. It was still, I remember, it would still be dark and real cold, and we would get to school, and sometimes the classroom would be open, and sometimes it wouldn't be, but when it wasn't, we would go downstairs. We had like a dining hall down underneath the church. It was called St. Anne's Hall, and the nuns also had, they always had like hot chocolate and sweet rolls and things of that nature. So it was the same nuns, believe it or not, Bob, from Ursuline over at St. Peter's. I mean, there was a big contingency of teaching nuns here at the time. And, I thank God for that, because, I consider myself very fortunate to have been able to attend at school, especially during those real early, tender, formative years, and have received the guidance and the education that is so vital and so critical at that age from those real dedicated professionals.
Did you ever have your knuckles rapped for anything you did in class?
Yes, Bob. Some of the sisters were, more disciplinarian and more authoritarian than others. Like for example, the sister that I had in first grade, she was a very loving sister. She would just scold us, but she would never use any corporal punishment. But as we got progressively into the higher grades, sometimes yes, you would have to put your hands on the desk, and the sister would wrap each one with a ruler or what have you. Or sometimes, I even saw, we had a paddle, when we got to the, I think the 4th or the 5th grade. And in extreme cases, the student would be asked to bend over and
take their punishment.
Take their corporal punishment.
Now, you were in St. Peter's for how many years?
I think until the 4th grade. And from there, my brother and I transferred over to St. Joseph's Academy, and my sister transferred over to Ursuline. And now St. Joseph's Academy at the time was an all-boys school, and Ursuline Academy was an all-girls school. So,
So you were the sexes were separated, right?
Yes, yeah, they're. The only time we would co-mingle would be like at a sporting event, at a football game or a basketball game, or.
What about socials?
Well, yeah, once in a great while there would be like a prom or a dance or something like that.
You'd get together.
Yes, but.
Now, how long were you at St. Joseph?
I was there until the 8th grade.
Now, was it a big deal when you graduated from 8th grade in those days?
Oh yes, Bob.
The cap and gowns and all that?
Yeah, everything, the whole 9 yards.
They don't do that today, graduating.
They don't?
No. But I mean, you actually graduated from 8th grade. You have a diploma that said you completed the courses.
Well, I've got a diploma somewhere in my treasure chests of memorabilia. After I graduated from 8th grade, I wanted to be in a school where, the athletic program would be a little more extensive. So I switched over to Martin High School in '49, and I attended Martin High from '49 to '53, and that was the year I graduated from high school.
That's Raymond Martin High School.
Raymond and Martin.
Yeah.
Raymond and Tifsa Martin High School, yes.
Well, that's a very famous high school in Laredo. I mean, it's one of the bedrock high schools, isn't it?
Well, yes. I'm sure you've seen it, and I'm sure you know where it's located.
Oh, yes.
The only thing that I would like to point out right now, Bob, is that it was built as far back, I think, as 1937 or 1938 for a cost of about $550,000.
Which was a lot of money in those days,
though. Yeah, $500,000.
Well, the Depression was on towards the later 30s, wasn't it? I mean, $500,000 was still $500,000.
Yeah, I guess that's one way of looking at it.
But I mean, by today's standards, it'd be chicken feed, wouldn't it?
Well, yeah, I don't think you could even purchase the ground for that much.
You graduated from high school in 1953. From Martin High School.
Correct.
Anything stand out in high school those 4 years? I mean, without going over every little detail, is there any 1 or 2 or 3 stories or things that happened that made an impression on you?
Well, those were still what I would like to refer to as growing up years, Bob. When I first went to high school, I was a very shy, very introverted young person.
Not a public speaker.
Oh no, by no means. I was, very afraid of just, introducing myself, meeting new people. I would just shy away from all that. And that was one of the things that I learned as a freshman because, I can recall that during our lunch break, we would go to the gym after eating, and there would be music playing, and the girls would be, walking around, and the guys would be walking around, and some of them would start dancing and this and that.
Just during a lunch break, during a regular school day?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
This wasn't a social event,
No.
or a dance or any kind
No. This was just, a regular school day.
Mm-hmm.
We would break for lunch at 12, and I think we didn't have to go back to class until about 1:30, so.
Were you allowed off campus or not?
Yes. Yeah, it wasn't a closed campus. You could either eat at the cafeteria, if you so choose, or you could go home and eat, provided you could get back in time. But what I'm trying to say is that, there was a lot of girls that, were milling around, and of course a lot of guys, and really all you had to do was just go over to one and ask her if she wanted to dance or if she wanted, to talk or whatever.
Company? Yeah.
Company, yeah, but, I literally had to force myself to do those kind of things, or even when I would meet.
Well, you were too shy to do that at the time.
One of the a person from the opposite sex in the hallway, I would kind of just look the other way or look down or what have you. I had to force myself to, look at her and say good morning or how are you or how are you doing or what have you. And it kind of just, I guess it's part of growing up, but that's one of the things that I remember. Another thing was the ability to, articulate my thoughts, and also the ability to reduce my thoughts to writing, which, I learned of course, in English composition classes, and the ability to work better with numbers, because during the grammar grades, I wasn't very good at math, but thank goodness that in my freshman year, I had a very good math teacher who taught me, the basics, and from there I started expanding, into other levels of mathematics, and the same thing with English composition, and of course one of my biggest passions, history. I had a very good English teacher in my, I think it was in my sophomore year, and I used to just hate history. I couldn't see the purpose of, studying dates and events and what have you. I said, well, what's the use of all this? But that teacher opened my eyes, to all the beautiful things, that history teaches us, and things that we can learn and so on about history. So, those, and of course, I also learned through my athletic endeavors.
Which were?
Basketball and field and track. How to be a better team player, and how to respect authority.
Were you a good basketball player?
Well, I don't know. I was a fair. I don't consider myself to have been an excellent, but I wasn't a mediocre one either. So I guess somewhere in the middle, Bob. Fair to middling, like they say.
And what was your specialty in track and field?
Well, I was mostly in the field events, in the sprints, and in the 440.
Relay, or
relay, yes. The things that I learned in sporting events was also to respect authority, and by that I mean when, a decision from the referee was handed down, that, the coach would tell us, look, I don't want to see anybody out there complaining at the referee about this and that and being disrespectful, and I guess that's the one thing that I see nowadays about with these modern day athletes, especially the basketball players, and in some cases baseball players. I see them being very disrespectful,
complaining about
very arrogant, complaining about everything and anything, and abusing their status, as supposed role models. And I find that very disturbing, Bob, because some of the language that they use has to be beeped out, and some of the antics that they portray on and off the basketball court or football field or what have you is inconsistent, Bob, with their supposed role as a role model. So,
well, let's talk a little about, did you get your driver's license while you were in high school?
yes, I did.
Was that a big deal or just a routine occurrence?
Well,
Actually driving an automobile or a truck or something, I mean.
yeah, Bob, I have to confess that, I had to take it twice because I didn't study the book. I thought I knew all the answers and I didn't.
Well, there was a lesson there, wasn't there, to some extent?
Yeah, that trooper showed me, that I wasn't as smart as I thought I was. So, and
but you got your license, and
I got my license, and
what was the first car you actually drove after you got your license?
My dad bought I think it was a 37 or a 38 Ford Coupe for me and my brother from this sailor that had come down from Corpus and was desperate to sell it because he didn't have enough money to get back. So, and
this was escape from the valley money he needed, right?
I guess he had been down here. And I think he had gone across the river and spent all his money, and he didn't have enough money to buy a tank of gas and get back to the naval base. So we used to have a shop, an auto repair shop right at the corner of Convent and Victoria. And of course we were on the way, right en route to where this sailor came in, and he saw and of course we had a few used cars outside that we would buy and sell. So he came in and boy, the minute my brother and I saw that car, we fell in love with it because it was a fire engine red 2-door Ford Coupe, and it had the
and your dad bought it for you?
Wide wall tires. Yeah, after much wrangling and what have you.
Well, do you happen to recall what the price was in 19?
Gee, well, I don't know, but I think he gave that sailor about $25 or $35 for the thing.
That's it.
And to me, I said, well, Dad, how are we going to pay you back? He said, oh, don't you worry about that. Your brother and you are going to keep working here,
Keep working
and you
here.
pay me eventually.
Now, also in high school, did you have your first so-called date with a lady or a girlfriend? Or
well, no, Bob, I never did have any girlfriends in high school. I guess the only time I would go out would be like to proms and dances and things like that.
What, did you have an escort with you when you went to those?
Yeah, but for some reason I just can't remember who they were. I kind of figured this question would come up during the course of our discussion, but I can't seem to recall who those girls might have been. It
didn't make an impression on you, right?
No, not one way or the other, Bob.
It just didn't. Now, when you graduated from high school, was that a big event, the actual graduation itself?
Well, in a way, yes, but I think that, I was really more eagerly looking forward to going to college. I was anxious because I had hopes and dreams of, going to college and getting my degree and going into the business world and setting up my own business and all that.
Did you do that?
Well, yes, as a matter of fact, I went, after I graduated from high school, I went 2 years to LJC, and then from there I went to St. Mary's, and I graduated in '57, so.
That was Laredo Junior College.
Yeah.
At that time, it's changed names.
Well, to me, it'll always be LJC, Bob.
Yeah. Well, that's right. But it has undergone a name change, right?
Yeah.
And you went there for 2 years, and did you get a degree from there, or you just got credits? Then?
No, I actually got an associate in arts degree, so, and I did use some of the courses that, I got credit for a lot of the courses that I took there because. And again, I had some very good teachers that, especially the one in English literature. Bless her heart, she was such a good English. I used to just loathe. I mean, it was more than a hatred. It was a loathing for English literature. When I was in high school, I absolutely saw no need whatsoever to, study about all those poets from England like Shelley and Keats and
Wadsworth and
Shakespeare and all that. I said, what's the use of studying all this stuff? I'm never going to use it. But anyway, when I got to LJC, lo and behold, it was one of the requirements. So I thought, oh my God, here I'm going to have to put myself to the grinder again. But anyway, I went in there with an open mind, and I said, well, this time I'm not going to be so stubborn and so obstinate. I'm going to try and learn something. And Bob, before I knew it, that teacher was so good and so efficient, in her ways of teaching that.
You got caught up in it, right?
I got caught up in it, yeah. And my friends, they used to tell me, Joe, I mean, what's the deal here? I mean, you seem to, you're taking copious notes on this subject, and you seem to know all the answers, and you're very eager to, learn more, and you get into discussions with a teacher and this and that. I said, what is it? I mean, how can you find it so interesting? I said, I don't know. I said, but it just got under my skin and in my blood, and I started to really like it.
You became a little bit of an expert on these English poets then and English writers?
Well, yeah, because this teacher would get up, before the class, and at times she would get so emotional, Bob, that her voice would start trembling, and I could see that, her eyes would start starting to cry. And I'd say, my goodness, I mean, if this lady thinks that this lesson is so important, there must be something here, something important. So I would pay more attention, and the more attention I would pay, why, the more interesting it would get, so.
So you graduated with a degree, and then you went to St. Mary's in San Antonio.
Yes.
And what did you study at St. Mary's?
Well, believe it or not, my major was in biology and my minor was in chemistry, because my parents had hopes and expectations that I would go into a medical field, But
you become a doctor?
Well, not necessarily a doctor, but more like a dentist. So, but really, Bob, I had no earthly intentions of doing that. So, but and of course, I didn't want to disappoint my parents either. So, I went and I went through all the degree plan and what have you. And when it finally came time for the graduation, my dad said, what's going to be the next step? I said, well, Dad, I'm going to have to go to Galveston to take what at that time was known as the dental aptitude test. And he says, okay, when is that? I said, well, that'll be like in about 2 weeks, right after graduation. So I went and got my ticket. I remember I went on the Greyhound bus to Houston, and from Houston
Which buses?
The Greyhound bus.
Yeah.
I rode the bus and I went to it was Houston actually, where the test was, where I had to take the test. And when I got over there, they gave us this piece of chalk, and a little whittling knife and what have you, and we were told to do all kinds of different things, and then we had a written test, that we had to take. But finally, Bob, the thing that really freaked me out was that in the afternoon, they told us, well, now, we have to show you what you're going to be doing also as part of your lab assignment. And they took us into this big area where they had a bunch of boxes, It was a real cold room. And I was still a little naive. I didn't know what really was going to come down. But anyway, this professor walks in and he starts opening up these boxes, these compartments. Mm-hmm. And lo and behold, they had all these corpses in there. I said, what is that? I looked, and then one of the 2 or 3 of the students at the time came in and they started, telling us, well, this cadaver here belongs to a certain guy, and this one over here to, And I said, and what? Yeah, he says, we have to, work with them.
Work on their teeth,
On
right?
their teeth and
open their mouth.
Open their mouth. And I said, you gotta be kidding. I said, no, he says, that's part of them. And Bob, that, at that point, I just decided, I said, well, I don't know how I'm gonna do this, but I'm gonna have to just tell my dad, Dad, this thing is over. I mean,
So
there's no way I
a case
can.
of you'd have to disappoint your dad
Yeah.
rather than follow through with something that you just couldn't bear to do.
No, that's right, Bob. I just couldn't bear to, or force myself to do
Open
something.
a dead person's mouth and look into their mouth, right?
Golly, it was just gross. I mean, not only that, but sometimes they would have to open their throats and what have you, or over here. And I said, no. I said, this is definitely not what I would like to be doing for the rest of my life. So
you chucked that and you came back to Laredo, right?
yeah, I was very nervous and, well, very disappointed, when I had to confront my dad and tell him.
What year was this, do you remember?
57, Bob.
57.
Yeah. So he says, well, he kind of took it in stride, I guess he kind of figured that I wasn't going to go through with it, but I started working in the family business right after that, and
Which was the family business?
the Laredo Motor Mart,
Okay,
which is that big building right across the street from City Hall.
right. That was the family business owned by your father.
By my father and my uncle, and some other family members.
And what did you do there? What was your first job in the family business when you?
Well, I was like a chief cook and bottle washer. I started working in the warehouse in shipping and receiving, and then I graduated into counter sales, working on the counter, waiting on customers. And then they gave me an outside sales job. And then after that, we branched out into another store, which I owned and operated for 10 years in partnership with my cousin.
And what was the name of that store?
The name of that store was Guerra Part Service. It was over on San Bernardo Avenue.
So now, when you were working in the family business, Laredo Motor Mart, do you remember what they started you out pay-wise?
Yeah, I sure do, but it was $35 a week.
And that was for a 40-hour a week or plus?
Well, plus, yeah. But I wasn't too disappointed or too discouraged or too disheartened because
you had something to fall back on in a way, right?
Yeah, well, and I was doing something that I loved, Bob. I knew that pretty soon the fruits of my labor would prove to everybody that I was worth a lot more, and that's exactly the way it worked out. So.
The time is the latter part of the 1950s. You're working at your own business, right?
Correct.
And the name of it again is Guerra
Part Service.
Part Service. And is there something big coming into your life? I mean, have you been dating anyone specifically, or did you?
No.
How did you run into how did you become acquainted with what eventually turned out to be your future wife?
Well, Bob, it's kind of weird because I guess I shouldn't use the word weird, but maybe strange would be a better word.
How about unique?
Unique.
Yes.
Okay, because I first saw Josie, my wife, when I used to have a 1954 Ford at the time, a little two-door coupe. And I would go to this service station downtown where the Western Auto Store presently sits. And I would see Josie pass by every once in a while, and I would...
Walking or driving?
Driving. Mm-hmm. And I would always wonder, I wonder who that girl is. And I finally found out who she was and where she worked. And one day in 1961, I got up the nerve to call her, and I told her, who was calling, and I guess she recognized me or remembered who I was, and I told her, that I would like to, talk to her and maybe go out on a date or what have you. So We did, she called me later that night and we talked, and pretty soon, about 2 or 3 nights later, we had our first date. We went to the movies. And
do you remember what you saw?
no, I sure don't, Bob. I remember the theater we went to. It was the theater that used to be right across the street from the old City Hall building.
Yes, downtown, right?
Downtown, and we all got to know each other better. This was like in April, okay? And we finally decided, that we had enough in common, and we shared enough common beliefs and what have you to think seriously about, sharing our lives together. And
after how much time went by before you came to that?
No, not not very much, Bob. I'd say about 6 months, maybe 7 months.
And you became engaged.
We became engaged in, I think, in November, and we got married in December, so right after Christmas, 2 days after Christmas.
Would you say you believe in short engagements and long marriages? Is that
Well,
what
yes.
would that be an accurate statement or not?
As far as I'm concerned, yes, Bob, because I don't believe in these long courtships, where you have to, know a person for years and years and years. Sometimes a relationship like that can, as far as I'm concerned, can get stale and old and, worn out. So Josie was working at the time for a Gulf Oil Company distributor, which is where she was working when I called her the very first time. And
But she knew who you were.
she knew who I was, and of course, I think she also knew my family. So the way our custom and our culture are required at the time was for the prospective bridegroom and his designee, which in this case was my father, to go over and talk to her father, and tell him what my intentions were,
But before we get to that, let me ask you this. Did you ask her to marry you before you went over there?
Oh, of course, yeah.
Well, what was her reaction when you said, let's get...
Not surprisingly, she said yes. So she said, even though, one of the things that I really have to give her credit for was that at the time she was working, and she was also helping her parents. So, that was always a cause of worry and concern for me, because I didn't want to disrupt her economic situation.
But wouldn't she continue to keep working after you were married?
No, because that was one of the things that we agreed upon. That once we got married, she was going to be a full-time wife, and which is the way.
So in other words, you would make the living, and she would make the living worthwhile.
Right.
Would that be a way to put it? I mean,
that's. I guess that's one way of putting it. Yeah.
So actually, she was going to lose her income if she got married to you.
Which is exactly what happened, Bob. And she agreed to that, and we had to tell her father, and her father said, well, this is more important, because this is something that it's due to the natural course of things that people get married, and they become one, and they start raising a family, and they have their own needs and necessities, and that's what they should take care of. So,
in other words, he was agreeable.
My prospective father-in-law was very, very happy and very agreeable, and I was kind of glad that he agreed, and that he was very amenable to the whole proposal that we were putting out, both my dad and I. Of course, at that time, my verbal skills were such that I was more inclined to let my dad do all the talking, and I would jump in only when absolutely necessary.
And you would second his remarks, right?
So anyway.
Way to go, Dad. Attaboy, Dad.
So, well, we got married, Bob, on the 27th day of December, 1961, and
After a short engagement,
after a whirlwind courtship.
you knew Josie, what's her last name?
Flores.
Flores. You knew Josie Flores less than 1 year.
Less than 1 year.
Would that
that's
be an
right.
accurate statement?
Absolutely, yes.
And you've been married how many years now?
Well, we celebrated our 37th or 38th wedding. Wait a minute, let me.
You're supposed to remember these things.
98, 37th.
37.
Yeah.
Okay.
37 years of connubial bliss.
Wedded bliss, right? But so you and she then went about the business of setting up a little mini household, as it
Well,
were.
yes, Bob, we rented this little efficiency apartment from my mother, which was in back of the house where my parents and the rest of my family was living at the time. It wasn't a very big apartment. It had about 2 or 3 rooms, but that was about all we needed until our firstborn came, Joe Jr. He was born in October of '62. But then when our second-born came, she was born in August of '63. Then things started getting a little crowded, so what we had to do was move into the bigger house, because by that time my parents had bought the home in which they lived over on Matamoros Street. So they let us have the house where they were living, and things worked out pretty good. After that, we had 6 more children, so we finally had 4 boys and 4 girls, and.
Was that by
The first
plan?
one-
Was that by plan? Did you plan to have 8, or
Well,
it just
no,
worked out
Bob,
that way?
we were just, I guess you could say we were just good Catholics, you know. We never used any birth control
Yeah,
or,
but you didn't plan to have 8 or 6 or 9 or
no,
just,
not really. It's just, that's just the way it worked out.
Okay. Well, I mean, some people go into the idea of having a big family. You didn't come from a particularly big family.
Well, yes, as a matter of fact, I did.
You had a brother and a sister, though, right?
Yeah, but no, actually, those were just my younger brother and my younger sister. After that, we had, let's see, 1 more brother and 5 more sisters. So
So
we
you
were,
keep a big family.
yeah,
So it runs kind of in the genes.
I guess, yeah.
So, of course, the birth of your children had to be a highlight, some of the highlights of your life. I mean, these children coming along, gifts from God. as
Gifts
it were.
from God, yes, Bob. I was so proud and so overcome with emotion each and every time that I just kept working harder and harder and harder. I had a retail auto parts store at the time, and from there we went for about 10 years, and then in '69 my partner and I split up. He kept the business, and I went into that's when I went into the service station business.
Who was your partner?
Margarito. He's my first cousin.
Okay. So he took the business.
He took the auto parts business, and I went into the service station business.
And it was located, which was located where?
Over there on Washington Street, at the intersection of Flores and Washington. It was a big Texaco station. And I ran that for 3 years. And from there, in '72, we moved over to our present location, or the one on 35 in Delmar. And we've been there ever since. So,
It's always been Exxon too, right?
well, at first it was Enco, and then they changed the name to Exxon, so back in the early '70s.
So you've 28 years in one location, basically.
Basically, yes, Bob.
The thing that many people recall about you, though, is not just the gasoline, but it's been the service, hasn't it?
The service, yeah.
And the service calls.
Right.
People are in dire need of problems. The batteries conk out or tires blow out or whatever, and you've been willing to go day or night,
Well,
holiday or not, just to go up, whatever it takes to service your customers, right?
it's to me, it's a real privilege, to be able to serve the motoring public. It gives me a great deal of a sense of satisfaction, to not just be there, in business, but doing something for people, that when they really need the service.
Well, let's talk a little about the life in Laredo from, let's say, the middle 60s on. What do you recall about living in Laredo?
Well, one of the things that, Bob, I don't think we've talked about, and I think it's worth mentioning, is that back in 1970, I had an invitation from the then mayor, J.C. Martin, Jr.
This would be Pepe Martin, wouldn't it?
Right,
That's
Mr. Martin,
yeah.
right, to see if I would be interested in representing the precinct in which we lived at the time, which was at 1703 Salinas.
Now, representing the precinct, what does that mean? I mean,
Well,
you go serve on the city commission? Or?
On the city council, yes. And I was kind of stunned, because the person that had been the city council member from that district had passed away rather sudden-like a few months earlier, and the elections were just around the corner, so Mr. Martin needed somebody,
Mayor Martin, right?
Yeah, Mayor Martin needed somebody from, from that district to be one of his council members. So.
Did you know him prior to him asking you?
Yes.
You had,
yes, as a matter of
discussions
fact,
with him or business, or?
Yes, Bob, because I had served as first as a poll watcher, and then as a
in the 60s, right?
in the 60s, and also as a clerk, election clerk at one of the polling places.
As a Republican or a Democrat or independent?
Well, there was no party affiliation at that time. It was just as an individual.
Well, the old party had no designation with Republicans or Democrats, right?
Well, no.
Not specifically, right?
Yeah, they did. But let's just say that everybody in town was Democrat, and I was a Republican. But for
in the
reasons
closet,
best known to myself, I was not very willing to divulge that.
Would you say you were a closet Republican to some extent?
That would be a fitting description. Yes.
But now, did the mayor know of your political tendencies when he called you up, or?
No, he just knew of my political inclinations. That I was always, at the different polling places, and always willing to help in any way that I could. But before then, Bob, I had gone by the mayor's office one time with another man that was very well known to him, and he took me, as his protege, and told the mayor that I was interested in politics, and that who I was and where I worked. And
who was that person who?
Oh, it was an old-time employee that I had working for me at that used to work for me at the auto parts place.
Well, he was pretty well connected, is that right?
Well, politically, yes, Bob. He was.
Do you want to say his name? Or?
Yeah, his name was Reynaldo Reina.
Okay. He
was a good friend of Honoré Lagarde, who was Mayor Martin's brother-in-law.
Yes.
So,
So that was the connection, really.
Well, yeah. So anyway, when we went there, Mr. Reina was, telling Mayor Martin what an up and rising political.
You were a comer.
I could be in this and that, but I needed somehow to, get into the political scene somehow.
You were just working on the edges,
I was just on the fringes, on the outside looking in, so to speak. Mm-hmm. And he talked and talked, and
well, what did he say? I mean, what was your impression of the mayor when you saw him up close and talked to him?
The mayor was the type of person, who could sit across the table from you, and without him saying anything, he would let you talk on and on and on, and before long, I mean, he had you pretty well sized up, and it got to the point where he stopped my friend, Mr. Reina, and he said, "Isn't this young man going to say anything? I mean, he hasn't spoken one word. I want to hear from him."
You let Mr. Reina do the talking just like you let your dad do the talking to your future father-in-law, right?
He says, "Don't you have anything to say for yourself?" I said, "Yeah." "Yes, sir." I said, "But I thought I'd wait until, the proper time was." He says, "This is a proper time, so start talking. I want to hear what you have to say." See, this is the kind of guy he was, very straightforward and very, I don't know, very.
Well, he didn't beat around the bush, but he'll let people play their string out.
Right. Yeah, and I guess that's exactly what happened, because when, the old man got to the point where he just didn't have any more adjectives to describe me with, Mr. Martin said, "Well, I haven't heard it.
Haven't heard anything
word
yet."
from this guy." He said, "Isn't he going to say anything?" So, Bob, one thing led to another, and
So the mayor supported you. That was tantamount to election almost,
yeah,
wasn't it?
Bob,
In
yeah,
those days?
Yeah, that was in 1970. We had this meeting, and there was I remember a cub reporter on the Laredo Morning Times that, was wanting to know about this and about that and what my position was on this. And shucks, I didn't know what to tell the guy, so I went and spoke to the city attorney, the special city attorney at that time, which was Bill Allen. Mm-hmm. And Bill looked at the set of questions and he started writing down the answers. He said, "Well, when he asks you this, tell him this. When he asks you this, tell him," and so on and so on. And that's how.
That was called political coaching, right? From Bill Allen, who in his own right is pretty well known.
Oh, yeah.
A very famous city attorney here.
Yes, but please bear in mind that he was not the official city attorney. He was the. Bill was a private, attorney. He had his own private practice.
But he was a confidant of certain people.
Oh, of course, yes. He had a very close relationship with Mr. Martin, and also we had another attorney, Mr. Frank Y. Hill, who was very, very knowledgeable in matters pertaining to issues concerning Washington D.C. and also in Austin, Texas, for the legislature and what have you. So
kind of lobbyist as well.
Yes, and also, Bob, back in those days, I remember we used to sit around the table. There was 8 of us, 2 from each ward, and we would get our agendas, and the discussions would take place and what have you. But one of the things that I remember most about those early days was that we would all be there, discussing and debating and what have you. And we would sit there smoking, Bob, and nobody would, think anything of it, All 8 of us used to smoke.
Cigars, pipes,
anything,
cigarettes,
whatever.
Anything you could smoke.
Yeah. And if anybody came into the council chambers, they were always, free to do whatever they wanted to do as far as, and now see where all those attitudes have changed. And
well, so it was a smoke-filled room.
Well, yeah. Yeah.
At the old City Hall, right?
At the old City Hall.
The old City Hall.
Yes. And somewhere between 1970 and 1974 was when former Mayor Tatangelo started coming to the meetings.
Attending them just as an outsider, right?
Well, yeah, but with a lot of ideas and proposals, because he was from, as you know, Bob, from another state, and they were used to doing things a little different over there.
Radically different, you might say.
And, yeah.
But let's talk a little about your election, because did you ever intend to seek public office? Was this a driving passion of yours?
Well, not necessarily a driving passion, but I did have some strong inclinations in that regard. I always wanted to know what it felt like to be, an elected official, so to speak. And of course, when I got the opportunity, I must say that I
jumped at it.
I jumped at it. Yes.
Were you challenged by anybody in that election in 1970?
Not that I can recall, Bob.
I mean, it was would you say it was a slam dunk because the mayor was behind you? I mean, that was. It was.
That's.
He's our guy, and that's it.
That's it.
No more.
End of discussion.
That's the end of discussion.
Yeah. And the same thing in '74.
Now, does that mean, though, let me ask you this, though, did that mean, though, that you always had to vote exactly the way a mayor suggested, or?
Well, not really, Bob, but, looking
Did you feel
back,
beholden to him and all? I mean, to some
well,
extent.
to some extent, yes. But Bob, all the items that were up for discussion in those days were nothing but housekeeping items. Regular stuff that I really sometimes wondered what the necessity of having a meeting for was. I mean.
You didn't talk about the important budget items and things like that? They were all done kind of by the mayor and...
Yeah.
More or less.
The mayor, more or less, that's right.
So in '74, you were up for re-election. Now,
Yes.
this was another... Were you faced with any opposition this time?
No, Bob, but by that time, a lot of little issues or big issues started surfacing. Like, when are you guys gonna start paving the streets here in Laredo? We had a multitude, just a multitude of unpaved streets.
Well, why was that so? As you look back on it from this vantage point, why was it so many unpaved streets in the middle '70s?
I don't know, Bob. I guess the town just grew, and those priorities were those needs, those necessities were never addressed.
Was it possible that some of the city officials regarded it just as a ranchito, and they didn't think paving streets was important on a ranch?
Well, no, I don't think it was necessarily that, but I guess a lot of people would just never say anything, until things started changing. We started getting federal funds, and of course that kicked off a lot of, public works activities and what have you, and
A lot of discussion.
a lot of discussion, yes, and.
And Aldo was in the middle of some of those.
Oh yes, yeah. And of course,
But you were re-elected in 1974 with no opposition, right?
I don't recall having had any opposition.
So now you were a two-term city councilman in Laredo. This is pretty important stuff for a person who wasn't big on communication, right? For someone who was basically shy to some extent. Is that right?
Well, I wasn't not so much shy, but not having too much to say. I would just kind of keep quiet and just
listen.
Yes, just listen.
So what happened in after 74, 78 came around?
Yeah, but let's back up a little bit to 76. That's when we had the big street department scandal.
Yes.
And things started going awry in a lot of ways. The people at the Community Development Agency started having to being held more accountable. And they were the ones that were in charge of all the monies coming in from Washington, and we had a lot of obsolete and outdated equipment at Public Works, and just a lot of things were going on. We had things that were purchases were not being accounted for the way they should be. A lot of discrepancies, and finally, Lawrence Berry came into the picture, and that's when things really went wild. Because
tell us who Lawrence Berry was, or what you know
the
of him.
first time I remember having met Lawrence Berry, he had a little print shop out in Guadalupe Street, close to the Arkansas Avenue intersection. And for some reason, I went in there and I needed some printing or something, and that's when I first met the guy. And he was, one of those unforgettable characters, that you can't seem to ever forget. And the thing that I remember most about him were his eyes, because he had these eyes that kind of just penetrated you when they looked at you. And I told him what I needed, and he looked at it, and he got most of what I needed done, and done in time. And then from there, I didn't hear from him for a while, but then we started having these programs on radio, Bob, and he was one of the people that would always call in, and I used to remember, I know that voice, until finally I put a face to the voice, and sure enough, a little after that, he started coming to the meetings, and he started, with his criticisms and what have you, and he would call a radio station, and then they eventually formed a group called COPS, I think that's what they used to call it, Citizens Organized for Public Service. Mm-hmm. And Aldo Tatangelo was part of that group, Judson Twist, Tomas Flores, Lawrence Berry, just a whole slew of Mavericks, and it finally got to the point, where when that street department scandal broke, the independent party, the independent club, started disintegrating, and of course when the elections came up in '78, Mayor Martin made the announcement that he was no longer going to seek the position of mayor. So,
well, that would have concluded 24 years as mayor.
Right. Well, let's see. He first came into office in 1954. So yeah, that's 24 years. That's right.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's the longest-serving mayor in this decade. I mean, this century, isn't it?
I think so, Bob. Yeah. And then, of course, by that time, Aldo had already announced that he was going to run for mayor.
Well, how did the street department scandal break? Do you remember? I mean, was there something that? It
broke through the sheer weight of its own ineptitude and its own corruption. I mean, there was so much stuff going on out there, Bob, that it just had to give. I mean, from what I understand, the staff members of the street department would go to the different places of business, where they would do business, and tell the owner, look, if you make me an invoice for, say in the case of an auto parts store, you bill out an engine, okay, and all the related parts, okay, and the bill comes to say, in those days, I guess $300. Theoretically, the guy would say, you give me $150 and you keep $150. How does that sound? And that's how they were doing it, see. But when Lawrence Berry went in there for his pencil audit, he found out that they had bought, I don't know how many engines in 1 year, how many batteries, and how many radiators, and a lot of other parts, and then they only had about a total of 24 or 30 units, So Berry put the pencil to it, and he says, "Well, what's the deal here? This doesn't add up." And in one case, I think they had bought something like 80 or 90 radiators for, like 30 units. So that means that they were changing the radiators like 10 times.
2 or 3 times a year.
Yeah, it was illogical, so.
They weren't too adept at juggling things, were they? So to speak. But now the mayor wound up having to spend some time behind bars, didn't he?
Yeah, but I think, Bob,
did he take the fall for some other people?
Yeah, he did, and
he didn't open his mouth.
That's right. He didn't, and that's exactly what happened. He had to take the fall for some of the other characters that were supposedly, his subordinates, and he was the only one that did any jail time for all that. So
all that corruption. He's the only one.
He's the only one, yeah.
Now, is it true that he?
Plus, he had to pay a very hefty fine also.
Is it true though that he spent his jail on weekends, or was that a myth? Did he go into jail on the weekends and come out during the week, or?
Yeah, something like that. I really can't remember what exactly the court order was, but it was something along those lines. Yeah.
Now, you were on the city council when this all broke, weren't you?
Yes, sir. I sure was.
Did any of this kind of spill over in your lap at all, or?
Not a bit, Bob. Not a bit. I'm sure my political enemies tried their best, to taint me with some of those misdeeds, but
Your skirts were clean.
My skirts were clean, and thank God I didn't get,
But you didn't know what was going on. In other words, you were kept in the dark, as it were, by the mayor and some of the department heads.
Yeah, I honest to God didn't know that, all that stuff was going on, so there was no way they could hang any of it on me, so.
Now, when the election came up in '78, where were you on that election?
Well, I was a council member, and, I told my wife, one night after a council meeting, I said, if I decide like the rest, because the rest of the council members said, we're not going to run for office anymore. This is it. Unless there's a big groundswell of, movement to encourage us to do otherwise, we're just going to forget it and just become private citizens like we used to be. So, and I told my wife, for some reason, I don't like that idea, because if I do, then people will perhaps get the notion that I was involved in this somehow.
Or knew about it.
Or knew about it. I said, why don't we do that? I asked her, what do you think about the idea of me announcing my candidacy to run again and, put my name and put my reputation and put my integrity up before the voters and see and let them decide to see if, what kind of a person I really am. And if I lose, well, I'll lose. And if I win, well, I'll be on the city council again for another 4 years. So we discussed it back and forth, and we finally decided, as a family, that that was a proper course of action. So we did it, Bob, and thank goodness we ran a very good campaign. I had about no less than 6 or 7 opponents that time, and
runoff?
No, I won without a runoff.
You slam dunked 6 other people?
That's right. Well, actually, myself and in those days it was two members per precinct. So the other guy that won with me also didn't have to go into a runoff. So. But you see, I think that's how jealous and how anxious people were to knock me down, because there was six other people that were up against me, and I was able to prevail without having to go into a special election.
Well, were you the only councilman that prevailed, or chose to present himself to the public?
No, there was one other, Charlie Zuniga, but he wound up in a runoff, and he had to, do another special election before he could be seated.
For purposes of this tape, can you tell your people watching this tape how much it cost to run for city council in 1978? Since you had opponents. In the other 2 races, you had no opponents, so it'd be relatively minimal, right?
Infinitesimal. But in 78, I did have to expend some of my own resources, and I don't recall exactly, Bob, but I think it was around $1,800.
Okay. Well, just
between $1,500 and $1,800.
That's kind of a ballpark figure, right? Now, you went on the city council. Was that the year that Aldo was elected mayor?
Yes, that's
so
correct.
You were part of kind of a reform movement. Would that be a fair statement?
Yes.
I mean, you served under the old system, and you were part of a reform movement that began with Aldo taking over, right?
Right.
I mean, having an Italian elected mayor in a town of 98% Mexican Americans, Hispanics was an overwhelming feat, though, wasn't it, to some extent?
Well, if you stop and think about it, Aldo had already lived here for several years, and he had a lot of knowledge of knowing people in the neighborhoods, He had a lot of charisma about him. People...
lots of energy, right?
Lots of energy, and people knew him because he had been involved in the anti-poverty programs, with a lot of different neighborhoods. So wherever Aldo would go, he would always be well received, and he had a fleeting knowledge of the Spanish language, so it wasn't like he was a total stranger, you know, to the community.
Well, how did you and he get along in the beginning?
Well, you know, we knew each other, and
Because he went to the regular city council meetings,
oh,
he was
yes.
there all the time.
Right. And I guess he really knew that I wasn't just one of the boys, you know. I had my own ideas, and I would so state towards the end of the Martin administration, we had an issue come up, and it was concerning meetings at night. This was right after the street department scandal broke. There was a big hue and cry for, you know, night meetings like we have them now.
So that more people could show up, right?
Well, sure, yeah, and so that we could have more citizen input. And of course, the most of the members on the old city council were dead set against that. You know, their position was that you know, city council meetings should be conducted during normal business hours.
When no one could show up.
Well, and you know, I disagreed, and not only did I disagree, but I prevailed, you know, because my friend Charlie Zuniga started speaking in like terms, and so we made the motion, and we got the city council to approve it. And I think Aldo and his group took notice of that. And then we had several other issues. Another one was the Civic Center issue that, you know, people were complaining about, oh, the rate structure and several other concerns that they had about the Civic Center. And I took that bull by the horns. I formed a little citizens ad hoc committee, because none of the city council members wanted to serve. And Bob, even though when I got through with all my recommendations and everything, I reduced them to writing. I took them before the city council, and to a man, you know, each man on that city council rejected my ideas and my recommendations summarily. But the people in the audience took notice of that, you see. So I came out smelling like a rose, okay?
Yes, you had the votes against you, but you won the people's favor, right?
Right. And several other issues, and I guess that's when Aldo started realizing that, you know, I wasn't going to be, you know, just a yes man or a rubber stamp. So by the time we concluded the election, Aldo and I were pretty much on the same page, you know, because he would call me and, you know, tell me things that he was putting on the agenda and things that he wanted my support on and all that. And I would, you know, I would go along with him, and he was always very appreciative. So we had a very, very good working relationship.
For that 4 years?
For that 4 years, yeah. At the end of 1982, then everything changed, because that's when the city went to the city manager form of government.
Changed the charter.
Everything, yeah. The new charter came in, and that's when I decided to take a sabbatical, which I did, as you well know, for 12 years. So.
Yes. And then you decided to get back on again.
Yeah.
You took on an incumbent named Eddie Perales.
Yes, sir. That was in 1994.
And it was you might say it was a hard-fought race, wouldn't you?
Well, yeah, Eddie was a formidable opponent. I mean, there's no doubt about it.
Well,
he was the incumbent.
He was an incumbent, and he also had a lot of IOUs out there, and he was a principal for a major high school, and so he was extremely well known, right?
Very well known, yes. Plus, he had a very strong voter base. You know, that people that had known him for many years, and you know, they obviously they were going to support him instead of me. But
to what do you attribute your victory in 1994?
Well, Bob, I guess number one, to the size of the district. You know, you know, my opponent had a lot of people behind him that were professionals. You know, in the education field like he was. But, you know, the thing that helped me a lot was that I had the vote and support of a lot of the people that were my friends and my customers, okay? And of
Who
course,
lived in that district.
Who lived in that district. So every time they would come in for anything at my place of business, they would also get a reminder, you know, that about the upcoming election and who they should vote for. So that really helped. Plus, I guess you might say my reputation about town was, you know, well, you know, Baba says, I don't have to tell you, but I consider myself to be a member of, in good standing throughout the community, you know, and I don't know what else to say. I just, you know.
Well, you won with, what, 60% of the vote?
Well, no, that was this time, but that time it was a lot closer. I only maybe 10 or 12 or 15 percentage points, but enough so that a special or runoff election would not be required.
And then
And for
you
that,
ran
I'm
again.
thankful.
Yeah, it saved you some money,
Yeah.
of course. And then again in '98, you decided to run. What prompted that decision?
Well, that decision was based mostly on the fact that I had a lot of projects and things, priorities that had been working on for the past 4 years, and I just didn't want to walk away from all that. I wanted to be sure that I would be there when those projects were either initiated or consummated, or became reality, in other words.
And your election, though, was not as close as the one in '94, right?
No, even though this time I had 2 opponents, but thank goodness we were able to, you know, get our message out to the voters, and the voters accepted it. Again, based on my past track record and my reputation, and I was very gratified to see that, you know, things went as smoothly as they did.
Now, are you aware that you may be the only elected public official served during 4 different decades in the history of Laredo?
No, I wasn't really aware of that.
Well, you have served in the 70s and 80s and in the 90s and in the first part of the next millennium, which would be the first 2 years of the first decade of the 21st century. That's accurate.
Yes,
God willing, you'll be serving till the year 2001, right?
That's right, Bob.
So, but nobody in memory that anybody has any records of that indicates that nobody has served during 4 different distinct decades in the history of Laredo, and that's quite an accomplishment, wouldn't you say?
Well, of sorts, yes.
Well, longevity means something, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Joe, what would you tell your children, grandchildren, or great-grandchildren who may see this tape at some point in the future? What do they need to know about their father, their grandfather, great-grandfather? What do they need to know?
Well, one of the things that I would like to impart on my on my grandchildren and great-grandchildren is the fact that, you know, I have been most fortunate to have been able to have been born, to live, and to grow up, to mature, and eventually die and be buried here in this great, beloved land of the United States of America. The one thing that I have learned through the years is that, you know, we must be very, very loyal, very patriotic, but most of all, very honest about ourselves, with our family, and with our elected officials, and of course with our country. There is nothing more sacred, you know, than our religious beliefs, but also our way of government. We must do everything that is humanly possible to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution and the laws of the United States of America. And if I could just sum it up in one brief statement, I would say that, you know, we have got to believe, and believe very fervently, in the concept of the work ethic. You know, you must deliver a certain amount of work for a certain amount of pay. There's no way of getting around that. We also must believe in the concept that there is no free lunch for anybody. Everybody has got to work and pay his or her own way. We must believe, in the biblical principles upon which this great country was founded. And that is that we must fear God and we must obey his laws, because one day we're going to be held accountable, not for our deeds, for what we have done and for what we have failed to do. And then we must lead by example. That is, we must be good stewards with our resources, both financial, physical, all our resources. We must take care of everything that God has entrusted to us. And of course, our family, that's very, very sacred. Your mother, your father, your sisters, your brothers, your grandmother, your grandfather. Keep that in mind. Don't ever violate that trust. And to sum it all up, I would just like to read from a little card that I have here, which has my name on it, and it reads as follows. I firmly believe in the principles that gave birth to America. Therefore, I believe without apology in the concepts of biblical law, limited constitutional government, the right of private property, and the free market system. I believe in less government, more personal responsibility, and with God's help, a better world.